Yeah, my
You can sit.
Manas Patnaik. I studied in Texas and then came back over here in 2010 with Microsoft. Um, my question being about returnee entrepreneurs, reverse immigration and the policy of the current government to do so is also taking shape at this point. How do you recommend, if you were to recommend, to go about that? Am I clear?
No, which government are you talking
Indian government.
about? Indian government.
Yes. About returnee entrepreneurs. Reverse migration.
Do you want to take one question at a time? Okay. You want to, okay.
I'm Ashish Kumar. I'm working with Oil and Natural Gas Corporation Limited. It's one of the energy sector company in India. My question is, see, you talked about the short-term impact of immigration and all those things. My question is, how we can take it as an opportunity for Western countries, because their birth rate are going down and they have, as you shown in the graph, their population declining. So how can Western countries, especially Europe, can take it as an opportunity to, improve their economy? That's it.
Yes, please.
Um, Hi, I'm Kanika. I'm from the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. And we are actually one of the only chambers of commerce in, I think, maybe the world to have a division dedicated to international migration and diaspora, which I work for currently. And what we mainly try to do is promote a business case for migration, which is essentially, I think, a lot of what you said in your presentation. There's been a lot of research to show that immigration actually benefits the countries of destination, as well as, of course, countries of origin, because of the remittances we get and all of that. And the business case is essentially saying that, why have companies, businesses been left out of the conversation, because they're the ones who actually hire these workers. They drive a lot of the, the reason for people migrating is often related to business development. So we have a task force also, comprised of our members, industry members, and we've been trying to create a lot of awareness on this issue. But even then, we feel like, despite all this research, there's a lot of negative sentiment, of course, in the world, and it's a very hard case to make. And you see at the global level, I mean, at all these, there's the GFMD and all these dialogues that happen where they say immigration's good, but not a lot of people are willing to, speak up for it, and even businesses as stakeholders aren't necessarily very willing to be involved. So how do you actually go and make this case, and how do you start the dialogue that you said that is missing in countries?
Let me start with the first question, which was about reverse migration. I think the Indian government should be very welcoming of people coming back. I'll just give you an example of the Chinese government. I've worked with them, and the Chinese government has been very, very welcoming of its diaspora coming back. Um, they encourage their students to go abroad, get foreign training, and come back. So I think Indian government should be very encouraging. They should allow the diaspora to come back and work here, or go. The rules of exit and entry should be liberalized. If people want to go, see, the thing is that if the rules are liberalized, then you will go. If you know that you can go anytime, you will also come back. Does that make clear?
What actually we're looking for is, what are those policy changes that India needs to do over here that will bring those people who have gone out to study in the US. It's like I returned back because I had a good opportunity, soft landing with Microsoft. But many people don't get that, and they're scared to return back, and also of the incentives. Of course, nobody wants to come back from the US. So how do we build that up? Just like you said, the Chinese people have 80% of the folks coming back to their country after studying. Why doesn't that happen in India, and how can we do that really in the coming decades?
So I don't believe in giving NRI some special soaps. I basically think that the policies of entry and exit, they should be uh, allowed to have dual citizenship, for instance. They should be allowed to come and go. The restriction on going as well as coming should be easy. I don't think you will come back only if you see opportunities here. So Indian government should make Indian economy or whatever role they can in fostering high economic growth instead of thinking that they can, giving certain incentives. On the other hand, I do believe that because of the high competition for talent around the world, I think Indian government should attract more talent. So I'll give you an example. In the US, they have a policy where after you finish your education, you can get an F1 visa or optional practical training. After the F1 visa, you can get optional practical training, and you can look for a job and stay there. But many industrialists, including Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, have said that why don't we attach citizenship with the graduation diploma. So that's a kind of policy where you're basically saying that if you think you have a job and you can stay, you stay. Indian government should also look at that kind of a policy, see whether there is any, they can encourage. So now I'm saying that Indian government should be attracting talent, and that's not necessarily our own talent from abroad, but talent from other countries as well.
But to just give you some numbers, it's true that the Chinese government has put out a lot of incentives, SOPs, particularly in the R&D and higher education space, which India hasn't done as much. But there has been a tremendous brain drain in the last reverse brain drain in the last 20 years, particularly in the IT sector. Do they need additional incentives? Over time, as jobs are becoming a critical issue, there is conversation on why corporates should be incentivized, not necessarily Indians coming back. Anybody who comes back and creates jobs, people who come back who are in a position of R&D to do more new patterns, eventually policies cannot be at block, because reverse brain drain isn't always a positive thing. We might want to get some people, some talent back strategically in certain sectors, and we might want to incentivize them. But I completely agree with Neeraj's point that specifically giving SOPs to NRIs or returning without a clear strategy for the government, meaning what sector is it that we want to promote through that, becomes a bit of an entry barrier for other forms of talent. But Neeraj, and before you answer, there was one key question in most of the statistics you showed, where migration is not leading to bad things. There's a huge self-selection of migrants. Migrants don't go to places where appetite will be low or where there are likely to be crime rate. So there is a lot of selection bias in a lot of these statistics that we sort of talk about in the economics and the social science literature. What do you have to say for that? I mean, has the literature accounted for this, or are we actually voicing our own biases, whether positive or negative, for what we believe is a good liberal value, and yet we do see that there is a resurgence of conservatism globally, and people are building barriers and communities are unwilling to assimilate these?
So yeah, I mean, I think you said it, that this is that immigration is something that selection. I teach a course on immigration, and I start with this, that immigration is selection. And that's probably the most beautiful thing about immigration. All the studies that I am citing here actually address the issue of selection in terms of, and I can go into the technicality of them if anybody is interested, but the point that you're making is that immigrants go to places where there are high wages. So whether you want to attribute the higher wages to immigration or to the fact that immigrants are selecting themselves to be there? Is it a cause of immigration, or is it causing immigrants to go there? And most research has that, whether it's on the effect of immigration on wages, or whether it's the effect of immigration of crime, or on the other factors. Immigration researchers actually come across this main problem, how to address that. And they've tried to do that in a few ways. One of the ways they do that, they use something called a social experiment. So for instance, because of something happening, for instance, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of people from Soviet Union went to certain countries. So there's a huge change in influx of immigration to these countries, which is not really related to the economic opportunities in these countries. And they look at the impact of that. And it's based on that literature that they mostly find that the impact of immigration is very modest. Similarly, the thing about effect of immigration on crime is modest. But the thing is, if you hear one instance anywhere in the world where that refugee was involved in it, you know, we have a very somewhat high tolerance for our local population getting involved in riots or crime, but we have much less tolerance about refugees. So it does create a fear, and I don't have an answer for that. But on the literature of economic effects of immigration, the literature mostly shows that the impacts are, overall impact is positive. And then if you only look at the United States, the impact is much more in terms of it's a country that attracts very talented people. Partly not because of its immigration policy, to some little extent because of immigration policy, but mostly because it has institutions of higher education that are very good. It has, it's the largest country in the world. It may not remain that, but immigrants are basically following money. It's the country that is the biggest economy, immigrants are going there. So yes, these studies address.
Do you want to take her question?
Your question was about involvement of businesses in immigration policy, and I think that's a very important aspect. Countries that have tried to use their bureaucracy in creating an immigration policies have always have found that it has not been very effective. So I'll give you the example of Canada and Australia. They went into a point system. So basically bureaucrats are sitting there and saying that the country needs so many nurses and so many doctors, and therefore these people we should give them more. This is more so for Australia, less so for Canada. But even Canada has given a point system. And what it realized that after several years of these point system, the country is getting more educated people. The country is getting people with a college degree. A large proportion of people who are coming and have a college degree, but they miss out on some of the other aspects, characteristics of people, motivation, innovation, creativity. They miss out on that. And the reason why I'm saying they miss out on that is that immigrants in Canada there's a huge mismatch in terms of the skills that the country needs and what they get. Immigrants get much lower wages as compared to native, local workers in Canada, and that gap has increased over time. This is a study that I've done with some of my colleagues, which is a comparative study between the US, immigrants in the US and Canada. So we've studied people, same kind of people who have, from the same countries of origin, within the same age and education brackets, and have left their countries of origin around the same time. And we observed them around the same time in Canada and the US. And what we find is that wages of workers in the United States are higher. So we compare them with the wages of workers, immigrants in Canada versus immigrants in the US, and we find that US immigrants are doing better, even though immigrants in the US are less likely to have a college education. And this is not just research. Canadian governments has recognized that, and now they are, along with their point system, they also have this expressway policy where they actually take into account the uh, employers' involvement in selecting immigrants. And the US has, we say at least in the last few years, several negative things have been said about US immigration policy, but it does have a better policy than many other countries in the world. And many other countries in the world are actually copying US policy. So this part of policy is basically US policy where they involve employers hugely in selecting immigrants or selecting workers.
And yet you'd say, going by recent events, that if there is lesser discrimination in the US, meaning US migrants relatively do better than Canadian migrants. In terms of discontent, one would imagine that Canada has lesser discontent by the way we're measuring it. Could it be that since we are really looking at discontent amongst voters, because eventually the policies of these governments will be determined by electoral politics? Right? So, how easy is it for migrants to become citizens in terms of having voting rights, and is that driving any of this difference?
So far it's not, but it might. And I think that might be one of the fears, that immigrants are increasingly becoming a huge proportion of the population in the United States in certain key constituencies, that they may become a very decisive factor in future, in the next elections or the elections after that, in determining the outcome of an election. I mean, I don't know how long Texas will remain a Republican state, given the composition of its demography is changing, and foreign-born population has been increasing there.
But again, I make the same mistake as which is migration as a liberal value, and yet the Indian community in the US, which is the richest migrant community, has been traditionally voting Republican. But that's also because they are, the income brackets. It's not just social liberal values. I think it also gets down into the tax policies of different and how these two match to sort of make that difference. We have time for maybe one more question. Could we get a mic to him, and then Dhruv, you? So we have two questions.
I'm from the IT services sector. Looking at the presentation, I'm assuming that the movement of skilled workers and their data points have not been included in this, or am I wrong on that?
Skilled worker is included.
Is included. So naturally the next question would be the percentage contribution towards the globalization or the development of the economy of the receiving country by the movement of the skilled workers alone, gives out a different pattern than the immigration of the non-skilled workers. That is one, and I think that speaks in volumes when it comes to the sectors like the IT services sector, the way they have been contributing to the receiving countries. The second natural question comes out is this particular aspect, irrespective which party is in power, somehow gets overlooked when it comes to the electoral politics, like Shamika mentioned. And naturally, then the country which is kind of from where the movement of the skilled workers is happening, it's their responsibility to be able to guide and showcase that particular contribution globally. You have been in US, and India has been a major contributor towards skilled workers to US. Do you think Indian government and the Indian businesses have done enough to showcase the contribution? If not, what more can be done?
So let me say something first about the skilled and unskilled. US society, government, institutions, all of them together, there's a huge group of people who are totally committed. So universities, for instance, or corporation, for instance, they're totally committed towards getting more and more skilled workers. The contributions of unskilled workers are people know that they do an important job, but it's not really recognized at the legislative level. Uh, but it's true that there are studies that show that when the industries that employ a lot of low-skilled workers, or especially undocumented people from Mexico, when those industries are booming, restrictions on undocumented immigration decline. So there is the policies are affected by even to encourage undocumented immigration flows as well. And I personally feel that it's possible to show through Nobel Prizes that immigrants have gotten, or through innovations or the industries that they've created, to show the contribution that skilled workers have made. The contribution that unskilled workers have made is enormous. And the point that I would make is that think of someone who's coming from Guatemala, a low-skilled person with very low education. That person has to travel the entire length of Mexico, have to face the enforcement officials in Mexico, and then have to face the enforcement officials in the US. They have to also face the gangs as well as the coyotes in Mexico. And for those who, after all this journey, are able to land in the US, there's something in their skill, in their determination, that cannot be measured with years of schooling, for instance. So I know this is an unconventional way of looking at it, but I think the US economy has benefited from both from low-skilled immigration as well as from high-skilled immigration. There are constituencies that are very committed to skilled immigration, and I don't think Indian entrepreneurs have to, or Indian skilled workers have to prove their loyalty. I mean, I think they will go wherever they find better opportunities are. If they think opportunities are better in India, they'll come here. If they think opportunities are better in China, they'll go there. But I do think that there are many in the US. Any policy that the current administration announces in restricting immigration will have to be fought in the courts. That we've seen. So I think the interesting thing about the United States is that it's very difficult to change policies there. And maybe the framers of the Constitution made it intentionally. They didn't want the policy to be changed instantly. So I believe, maybe I'm just an optimist, but I think most of, and we've seen that happening so far. Any policy major change that happens, it has been taken to the court. And I think that might just happen for a lot of such policies. Because there is a lot of commitment towards high-skilled immigration. And people like Bill Gates and other industrialists have been saying, why don't we just stamp a green card on the people who are graduating on their diploma, especially for STEM workers. So there are people who are very, very strongly pro-immigration, especially skilled workers.
By the way, Hyderabad happens to be the largest contributor to STEM cohort. Hyderabad, this is not India. One city from India. There's an excellent study which came out of Brookings 3 years back by a scholar called Neil Ruiz out of the Metropolitan Program. I recommend you take a look at it. It's really good because it maps migrants into specific STEM requirements.
Let me just add this to that point. This is an opportunity for other countries that have failed in attracting immigrants despite following the United States policy. Germany they announced a green card, which was basically like an H-1B program They just called it green card so that they thought more people will come. It's not many. There weren't many takers for the U.S. H-1 visas are finished within a few weeks of the beginning of the year. So this is a time for many countries that have been trying to replicate U.S. immigration policies to actually give incentives to skilled workers to attract them. Because this is a time when they can show, well, you know, U.S. is not open to, you can come as well. This is where international skilled workers are international workers. They'll go where the opportunities are.
There is evidence of this already happening in terms of applications to Canadian universities. They have gone up multifolds. In fact, in Montreal University alone, HEC, 7-fold increase in PhD applications. And that's largely because of the policies in the US. Drew, we'll give the last question to you.
Okay, so my question relates to the two types of immigrants you talked about. There are the immigrants that are wanted by the country, and there are the immigrants that aren't. Like in California, they have a shortage of farm workers, and California would really want some workers there. So I was wondering if there's been any sort of empirical study or a relationship between how much a place actually needs those immigrants to what the attitude towards immigrants are, and whether you know anything about that.
So California is one of the few states in the country, including along with with New York, that is very positive towards immigrants. California has had ups and downs on their attitudes towards immigrants. In 1994, they passed Proposition 187 that actually denied undocumented immigrants any public services. This proposition was rendered unconstitutional in 2000 by the Supreme Court, but since then, most policies in California have been pro-immigration. And I'm not sure whether the literature that has looked at attitudes towards immigrants have gone into the details about, because you see, most of the time the surveys that have data on attitudes, those surveys don't have large samples. They are maybe 2,000. The GSS has maybe 1,000 or 1,500 respondents every year. So these surveys are really tiny, and I mean, overall, if you look at it, they do a survey every year, so overall the number is very large. But in order to get at this issue, get out of the issue of selectivity that you were talking about, Shamika, you really have to have a very large sample. So I don't think people who've done studies about the attitude towards immigration have been that scientific in terms of looking at whether immigration is causing the attitudes to I mean, there are studies that have looked at, that have addressed selection, but not in as rigorous a manner as the other studies that have large samples, that have particularly looked at the impact of immigration on wages, on industry, or things like that. But then again, in terms of attitudes, their selection would be even higher. That immigrants would go to places where they're more welcome, right? So it becomes even more difficult to address that. I hope that answered your question.
Great, that brings us to the end. Thank you all.